this is Laborc, and it is so nice to have you here. Have you ever felt lost trying to place highlights on miniatures? If the answer is yes, worry not, because Papa Laborc will show you how it's done. And these are the paints you need if you like to paint Magneto with me. The first thing, which is the foundation of any highlighting method, we need to determine our light source. Once we get that figured out, we will have a steady reference point. Let's look at the mini under the lamp. As you can see, I'm primed it black already. This miniature is part of the Marvel Zombies board game, so I have this nice ID card for him as a reference. You might think, yeah, Papa Laborc, if I had a nice illustration for my every mini, it wouldn't be hard to figure out the highlights. Okay, calm down, first of all. And let me show you a method that will work for every miniature, and you don't need an illustration for that. But I'm painting minis from this game, so I try to hit two birds with one stone, okay? Okay, so as you can see, light is coming from the left and from the front. I indicate that with my brush. Thanks to the primer's satin finish, we can see the maximum highlights very well on the miniature. So all you need to do with whatever mini you are painting is to hold it under a lamp and take a picture with your phone. Now you have a constant reference for your highlights. Try different angles and use the best one. This mini is quite symmetrical, and yet the ID card pretty much gives it away which angle works best, but you can find that angle easily on your own. Also, this character has a nice OSL edge highlight all over his torso. We will talk about that on Patreon with the base as well. So, we have a highlight reference and determined our light source. Alrighty, we start with the cloak. I use the airbrush for that, just to speed things up. You can do this without an airbrush, but I will do it with one, okay? I aim the airbrush like it's a light source for the most part, so I'm basically spraying from above the miniature. Not all the time, because there are some angles I can't hit that way with the airbrush. I'm focusing three things while spraying: opacity, highlight placement, and surface. I like to have maximum opacity over the highlights that face towards the left or generally facing up towards the sun. Or to the ceiling in my case, because Papa Laborc is no hippie, so I'm not painting outside, okay? Now the surface we have is a soft fabric. Well, obviously it's PVC, but we need to paint it like it's the softest, coolest cloak ever, so we need a smooth transition from black to this dark purple. That's why I'm applying the paint layer by layer and build up the opacity over the highlight areas. I'm applying some paint over the shadow areas, and this also works to smooth out the blends and diffuse the satin finish of the black primer to a more matte surface. Now grab a nice brush of your choice. I'm using these crappy off-brand Kolinsky sable brushes, but if you have anything fancier that is not a hobby brush, because those are quite rubbish, use that. This process of highlighting the cloak is crucial. We have to sketch out the highlights that we have on our reference photos. The more precise you are at this phase, the more time you will save. Let me explain. Every cloak has some nice folds. These are starting in a small cylinder-like shape and usually end up in a bigger cone-like shape. So, we need to break down these complex shapes into simpler ones. Like if we have a complex problem, we need to break it down into small problems. Okay? How do we highlight a cone, you might ask? Well, the highlight reference picture is going to be answered 80% of the time. But since it's mostly cylinders and cones, let's look at one. If you went to art school, you would have drawn a couple of these shapes and you would have hated it. But these are the foundation to highlight basically any shapes. Obviously, these are very basic and don't work for all materials, like metals, or if something is made of jello, or something has multiple light sources, but most of the time these studies give you a nice reference. Okay, so I'm building up my layers over the highlight areas and adding more paint to some shadow areas as well, which is not really about the highlights, it's more about my desired mid-tone. But I don't want to get into that subject because I feel like that's a subject for a different video. So we have these nice references, so we basically just copy them as our highlights. Okay? So you can see the highlight shapes are kind of these vertical gradients that are following the shapes of cones and cylinders. And this is what we need to reproduce on the clock. Once I'm kind of happy with my sketch, I start to blend in the highlights. Blending is also a subject in itself. It's more common that you guys don't know how to blend than paint highlights, and I will definitely make a video about that as well. I know I keep saying this, but pinky promise, I will do it soon. So I basically thin down the paint a bit and remove the excess on a paper towel. If you are familiar with grazing, it's something like that, but not so strictly. I just move the paint from the shadow to the highlight color, and then I go back with the shadow color and reverse the motion with the brush. And I repeat the process like, I repeat the process until it looks like smooth, like Granny's butt cheek. It's time consuming, but having nice blends is something I prefer, so it's up to you how smooth you want your highlights to be. Now back to the highlighting. I reduce the highlight areas, and this is very important, inside the previous highlight layer, okay? When you're highlighting, there are only a few occasions that you like to go outside of the previous layer. Maybe you want to add texture or do some edge highlights for NMM, but most of the time you stay in the previous highlight layer to build up a smooth transition and indicate our light source more clearly. Now remember the 3 points: opacity, highlight, surface. This mini has the same colors on different parts of the suit. We can tell that the cloak and the pants can be highlighted the same way because they are more or less the same fabric. But the frame around his neck holding the cape and the belt around his waist is different, and light behaves differently on different surfaces. So on the belt, I just want to make smooth blends with my first highlight, but I will create these parallel squares without any blending. The belt is obviously a cylinder shape, so we can look at our highlight reference for cylinders. Keep in mind that on the ID card, this belt has a very glossy plastic finish, so a more metallic reference would be ideal. On the collar, I will have some blends, but not as smooth like on the cloak. Also on the cloak, remember that light is coming from the left, so the right side of the little or big cone shapes that makes up the folds have to be darker for our highlights to make sense and look believable. After that, I do some blending the same way I did in the previous blending step. The more you blend and more you highlight, the more precise you need to be with your brush strokes, so all your shadow areas could be clearly separated from the highlight areas. And that will create a very clean look that I prefer, okay? No splotchy dried up highlight colors in the shadow areas, or I will slap on your tiny hand. With an off-white, I paint the maximum value highlights on the collar and the belt. Just a tiny bit of these highlights, and on the belt all these highlights need to be parallel to each other. On the collar I just copied the same highlight that I have on the ID card with some thin layers of paint. I go back to the boots and gloves and continue the highlight process with a bit muted highlight on those surfaces. Let me know in the comments what shape does the hands, fingers and boots have. If you guessed cylinder, then I won't slap on your tiny hand. That's right, we highlight them as cylinders, but the highlights will appear on different parts according to our light source. But you can see that most of these highlights are on the left side. If you look at it from the front, because as we declared in the highlight reference picture, light is coming from above and a little bit from the left. I also add some secondary highlights to the belt and blend in the color a bit with this color. On the character's left hand, you can see that I move the highlights a little bit more to the top part. I like to paint an OSL effect later, so that's why I moved it a bit. If you don't want to paint that, just copy the highlights as they are. Okay, at this stage, I start to paint the face. I try to paint it for the camera, but I like the eyesight to do that properly, since we have so little surface to work with and I had to look at it so close. So I couldn't fit in the camera without blocking the whole view. So the face and some minor details on the helmet and collar are included in a PDF attached to the Patreon post. Now it's time for the red suit. This is where it gets interesting, because the muscles of the body are a bit complex, but we can break them down just as easily as we did for the previous parts. I'm covering 80% of the surface with word barrels red. I leave the recesses that face towards the ground or would be blocked by a shadow black. I increase the opacity of the red over the shadows where it should get a little bit of our light source, like the parts between the kneecap and the quads or the upper abdominal muscles. We are not treating every muscle differently, we just like to know where our extreme shadows would go. I also highlight the helmet at this stage. The helmet is a cylinder ending in a spherical shape, so the highlight at the top should be a circular shape, and on the side just some vertical stripes, just like on the belt. See? It's easy once you get the hang of it, because everything is a cylinder, a sphere, a cone or a cube, or the mix of these shapes. We are at the blending phase again, so reduce your paint to a thin consistency and move the paint from the black to the dark red layer. It's quite an easy blend since the black and dark red are close to each other in value. At this stage, we need to focus a bit more again. Light is coming from the left, so we can leave the right side a little bit darker, so we curb the volume and start treating the muscles as different shapes. We would like to keep the previous recessed shadows for more contrast on the torso, but on the legs, we like to have some softer shadows between the quad muscles. So at first, I'm sketching these highlights and glazing over them a little bit where I like to make them softer. I build up the opacity again with thin layers, and if the volumes of the highlights are too much, then I go back with the previous color to fix it. Over highlighting is a thing, and the only reward for it is a slap on your tiny hand. I don't really blend after this stage because these two colors are close to each other in value and hue and blend very easily if you just use thin layers. Okay, now we push the contrast and define those highlights nicely. The character's right side needs to be more dominant with the highlights, so I start covering the chest, abs and the thighs. Thin layers again, but I leave some of the previous layers visible, otherwise I get rid of our nice and smooth gradients. I don't want that, and you don't want that either, because if you do, I will slap on your tiny hand. Be precise with your brush and always angle your mini in a way that is comfortable for you, so you can avoid hitting already painted parts. We always move the mini to weird angles and not the brush, okay? On the helmet, make the transition nice and smooth for the special highlights and paint the raised parts of the muscles on the back, like the forearms and the triceps, because Magneto is jagged and he's old. Do you guys often think about this? Old guy with muscles? They are so intimidating. Like it's some sort of paradox. You have less time to live, yet you look very muscular and healthy. Stay with me guys, because we are close to the finish line. I mean with the suit, because that base... Yeah, that base is a time sink on its own, but let's focus here. We paint the maximum highlights with some thin layers. Now I will only, and I really mean only, use this layer on the right side of the character, okay? This is the moment we built up these highlights for. And to make sure our light source is clear and defined. I mean to make it obvious where the light is coming from. Only use it on the top part of the pecs and abs, and we will blend it in nicely. We do exactly the same on the helmet, so every time you paint a mini you need to think about the light source and make it obvious where the light is coming from. This way all your miniatures will look more consistent and realistic. If you look at the highlight reference picture and the painted mini side by side, you can tell that not all highlights are at the same place. For example, the helmet. The highlight on my mini is a little bit more to the top on the helmet because it would have been harder to paint a highlight between the binding of the helmet and the little symbol. Or you can see on the back there is a secondary highlight on the lower half of the helmet. To be honest guys, I didn't use the highlight reference photo for the most part while I was painting this specific mini. But if you watch some of my earlier videos, I keep talking about it to use them all the time, because after a while you don't really need them.
What are you trying to tell me?
That I have to use a highlight reference photo all the time?
No, Neo. I'm trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
Painting is very similar like playing an instrument. At the beginning you need sheet music to play, but after you train your ears you can play any melody just by listening. I mean, I can't, but I knew musicians that can do that. Okay, now we put the sherry on top. You know, it's not really a Papa Labor's video if we don't use ice yellow, so we do that now and paint the maximum highlight on the helmet with a cute little dot. This little dot reflects the sun as our natural light source. Which, and we can say it together, is coming from the top and a little bit from the left. So how's Magneto looking? Not too shabby, right? I mean, every once in a while I'm quite happy with what I paint, and this one came out quite nice, if I do say so myself. I hope you guys learned a thing or two about highlight placement. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, please. As I mentioned before, the base painting and the OSR tutorial of the video is Patreon exclusive. If you like to access that content, consider joining my Patreon page for a price of a coffee, basically. And it's not like a Starbucks type, you know, just regular. Guys, it's cheap. That's what I'm trying to say. But I'm very grateful for your support. So huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos, with special shout out to Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy Macrash, Panoman45. If you like to support the work of Papa Laborts and get access to PDF guides for exclusive characters of the game, you can do that on Patreon. Or if you need a little bit of extra help, online coaching is also available. I hope the rest of your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.